So there's no need to be in the comments like, you forgot to mention. I know, it's for part 2, okay? What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new, and a ton of you are new, so hey, hi, what's up? In today's video, we're going to be talking about It Chapter 1, full of warnings ahead of time if you are not familiar with the story. It is a dark story full of conversation about abuse in all types and all forms. So if you are not in a mind space or a head space to talk about this or to kind of listen to this conversation, I am going to handle it as delicately as I possibly can, but if you are not in the space for this, please skip this video. This is not a horror channel. Even though all the videos I've done so far have been horror based, I'm going to be getting away from that in the new year for a little while to give my mental some space, even though there is a part 2 to this video, obviously. So if you are ready to dive in, let's talk about It Chapter 1. Derry, Maine is a dark ass town, literally, figuratively, however you want to look at that. And it's not just because there is a literal clown haunting the children, but it's the underlying systemic neglect and silence that's peppered all throughout Derry's history. On the surface, it might seem like the story is really about challenging a supernatural entity, but really it's about children who live in a town that is rife with complicity, fear, and violence, and where abuse is normalized and unchecked. At the heart of It Chapter 1 is the Losers Club. There would be no story without them. Their lives are shaped by their shared trauma and the oppressive forces that live within the town of Derry, aka the adults. Each of the kids' stories reveals a piece of Derry's rotten history and offers insight into the personal and societal struggles that many of us probably recognize. Childhood trauma is an often overlooked part of who you become as an adult. Suffering intense trauma can alter your brain chemistry, resulting in depression, anxiety, PTSD, and various other forms of mental illness. Not to mention, it can manifest itself physically in conditions like PCOS, endometriosis, POTS. However, as we age, you would hope that the idea is that we start to heal from the things that happen to us as children. And I just want to say a quick aside, if nobody has told you ever you didn't deserve what happened to you, you were a child and they were supposed to protect you. But we also have to heal from those things, right? That way, if we heal, we can avoid passing on the same cycles to our children, our younger siblings, our younger cousins that we promised we never wanted to perpetuate when we became adults ourselves. In previous videos, we have talked a lot about identity and the way that our experiences shape who we are as people. If you haven't seen my Rocky Horror Picture Show video or my video on Psycho or even Carrie, I will link them in the iCard above somewhere here, and they'll be in the description below. The film does a great job at portraying how the Losers Club and their personal fears and traumas shape their identities and how their fears will evolve into adulthood. But put a pin in the part about adulthood. We're not going to talk about that until we get to Chapter 2. A major theme in it is the way that trauma is carried across generations, especially in marginalized communities where cycles of abuse and trauma are passed down or could even be exacerbated by outside forces. There's this novel that I read called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and in this novel it explores how trauma impacts the body and mind. One of the key concepts of the novel is how trauma can leave you in this perpetual state of hyperarousal. So this is basically like your fight or flight mode. And this is where your mind and body are constantly on alert, looking for danger. Throughout the film, the Losers Club are constantly on edge at the start, primarily because of their own individual traumas. So when Pennywise starts to terrorize the town, the hypervigilance that the kids have learned to live with in their daily lives starts to become almost unbearable. Throughout today's video, we're going to take a look at each child's unique reaction to their trauma and also take a look at how it can be a blend of nature versus nurture. I am sure in the year of our Lord Beyonce 2024, we have all heard of nature versus nurture. But recently, scholars have actually come around and realized that most actions are not a result of one or the other. It's actually a combination of both. For example, Bill's determination to confront Pennywise could show that he is inherently resilient, which is part of his nature. According to van der Kolk, trauma survivors often struggle to process their emotions, and instead they begin to exhibit behaviors that are reactions to stored trauma. Each of the members of the Losers Club's coping mechanisms could reflect their unique combination of natural temperament and the ways that they have been nurtured to respond to fear. So Bill's insistence on a confrontation with Pennywise could be moving forward due to Bill's nature, but the murder of his little brother Georgie and the grief that follows would also contribute, which is nurture. The environment that Bill was in created the actions that he takes later. So let's take a look at all of the members of the Losers Club and how their trauma contributes to the first showdown with good old Pennywise. Mike's story in the 2017 version or remake of It Chapter 1 is pretty watered down in comparison to the role he plays in the novel and even the 90s version of the miniseries. That said, because we're talking about the 2017 film, I'm going to leave my thoughts on that for another time. If you are at all interested in hearing me cover the miniseries or maybe the book, let me know in the comments. The book is rough, so I don't know, but the miniseries, totally down. Mike's story is interesting for a few reasons. He's the only person of color that hangs out with the Losers Club, and it looks like his family might be the only family of color in the town of Derry, which would explain some of the conversations that Mike has with his grandfather throughout the film. When we first meet Mike, he's in a barn with his grandfather, holding a staple gun kind of thing to a goat's head. Look, I'm not an outside girly. I'm a California city girly. I don't know what those things are. Leave it in the comment if you know what it's actually called. Mike hesitates, and his grandfather takes the gun out of his hand and does it for him, telling him, you either get busy living or get busy dying. You can't be scared to take your place at the table. And there's a few takeaways from this scene and the symbolism with the goat that I want to briefly talk about for a second. So the way that I interpreted this moment was that Mike's grandpa is using the tough love approach that many families are associated with from generations who have experienced extreme trauma. Think of some of our grandparents. This phrase is Mike's grandfather trying to teach him that hesitation or fear can be fatal in a world where cruelty and violence are normal. But there's a little bit more here as well. Okay, we're about to get religious, and I like to talk about history, so we're going to take a quick little history religion break and talk about this for a second. In most Abrahamic religions, the goat and lamb are often associated with death, atonement, and sacrifice as a way to appease a higher power. In many cultures, goats are used in rituals as symbols of purity or innocence, and their sacrifices can be seen as a way to cleanse or protect others from evil. So with this framing in mind, Mike's hesitance to shoot could be a symbol of his attempt to hold on to his childhood, although he's growing older. Mike is about to be placed into a situation where he has to grow up much quicker than he should have to. And Grandpa's shooting of the goat in front of Mike could be symbolizing the fact that Grandpa is shattering Mike's ideals of what being a child in the town of Derry really means. It's all fun and games, but the reality is eventually you're gonna have to grow up. It's a loss of innocence that we'll see be mirrored throughout all of the Losers Club story as we proceed. The higher power aspect could also be Mike's loss of innocence being sacrificed to Pennywise, but we'll talk a little bit more about why that could be in part 2. If you know, you know. There is a theme of remaining an outsider and how Mike's grandfather sees that as safer for Mike than trying to integrate himself with the people of Derry. That's a really powerful conversation, so let's break it down for a second. Mike's story centers around a lot of racial tension and isolation and historical trauma. Much of it mirrors how marginalized communities often have to have a deeper understanding of where they are, where they live, where they're traveling to or traveling through in order to make sure that they can survive and or stay safe. So during the 60s and 70s, when marginalized groups including POC and queer communities were fighting for basic civil rights like access to clean bathrooms, the right to marry, or being allowed to walk into the front door of a restaurant and eat in said restaurant, there were consistent conversations about whether or not integration with the majority was the best option. If you think about it this way, if someone makes it very clear that you're not welcome somewhere, do you keep showing up anyway? When you're at risk of being murdered, assaulted, or arrested for existing in certain spaces, would you still want to go? Part of understanding Mike's family's perspective is understanding the time frame in which this story takes place. The novel takes place in the 50s, which means that the Civil Rights Act hadn't even been passed yet, and segregation was still rampant in a lot of areas of the United States. Because Maine is more northern, segregation laws in the area likely weren't nearly as stringent as they would have been in the South, like there weren't actual Jim Crow laws on the books. However, that does not mean that people of color were safe or treated better. African Americans in Maine were subjected to something called de facto segregation. This means that it was more subtle, like being refused lodging at a hotel, being refused meals at restaurants, or even being refused the option to fill up at the gas station. Blacks were shut out from career jobs like medicine, law, firefighting. Even famous musicians like Duke Ellington were forced to stay at the only Black-owned Cummings House Hotel when they were in town. If you want to read a little more on the history of Maine and segregation. I have an article that I'll link down in the description below that's really interesting. So the novel takes place in the 50s, but the film takes place in the 80s, which is a little bit after the civil rights movement would have taken place. But this also means that Mike's grandfather likely lived in a time where the rights of marginalized people didn't exist, and he also raised Mike's parents under that same pretense. When we bring it back to the film, his grandparents' hesitance to integrate Mike into the society of Derry makes more sense when you consider what happened to Mike's parents. It's revealed that Mike's parents died in a fire, likely tied to the black spot that Ben references in the library earlier that was perpetuated by Pennywise. The black spot was a place where Black World War II veterans would hang out, and it was a place of racial violence, unfortunately. The black spot was burned down and everyone was still inside, locked in. So when Mike has his first encounter with Pennywise, it makes sense that it would be this vision of the burned bodies reaching out for Mike's help at the butcher where the black spot used to stand. The black spot fire is a direct result of the hatred and racism that existed in Derry, and is central to Mike's understanding of the town's legacy and likely reinforces his sense of alienation from the town. Mike's grandfather's warnings are an acknowledgement of the trauma of the fire, along with the continued racial violence in Derry, and how it's something that Mike will need to contend with for the rest of his life. His grandpa is trying to ensure that Mike doesn't internalize the oppressive system around him, but it also means Mike must continue to live in isolation, unable to fully escape the town's dark history. If we are going to talk about the way that trauma manifests in your body, we have to get straight to talking about my girl Beverly. And again, this is going to be a really rough section, so I will leave the time card here somewhere if you want to skip her story entirely. When we first meet Beverly in the film, she's hiding in a bathroom stall where a group of girls follow her and then decides to dump trash water on her head because bullies, I guess. The girls in Beverly's class label her as being promiscuous, and they project this societal shame onto Beverly, even though, as far as we know, her actions have always been innocent. When she goes outside, she meets Ben for the first time, and we see her snapping into woman mode and becoming a little bit more flirtatious. This is likely an attempt to regain control after the trash dumping incident. Instead of remaining a victim after the incident, she shifts her focus and starts to establish a sense of agency in her interactions with Ben. In this moment, it becomes clear that Beverly has likely been exposed to male attention inappropriately, and because of this, she leans on flirtation because it's a behavior she knows garners responses. This allows her to feel like she is in charge of the moment, and this is something that happens with a lot of victims of sexual assault. Just as a fair trigger warning, we're going to talk a little bit about sexual assault and incest, so again, please take care of your mental health and don't proceed unless you're ready to hear about these conversations. In the beginning of the film, Bev starts her period, and that's a moment of stress for her. This ties in with my previous video on Carrie, and we talk about the coming of age that's associated with starting your period. Carrie was unaware of her period because her mother refused to indulge Carrie in anything sexual, whereas Beverly, in her reluctance to start her period, is deeply rooted in what this symbolizes. Beverly is now a woman, and this is a moment she can only assume that her father has been waiting for. Her father is physically abusive, and I have seen some argue that he's not sexually abusing her, even though there is a scene where he's literally climbing on top of her and unbuckling his pants. But I digress. Just, make sure you watch yourself around people that think that way. Just saying. The way that his sexual abuse are conveyed is often through his overbearing obsession with her purity. He constantly questions Beverly about her interactions with boys, acting in a way that goes far beyond typical parental concern. His intense fixation on her purity and his frequent accusations about her sexuality are red flags, I guess, to put it lightly. Beverly is someone who has been manipulated and controlled, facing a distorted and harmful concept of what love is supposed to be from her father. This is what makes Ben's kindness to her earlier in the story so important to the growth of her character. This was a moment for someone to treat her kindly with no strings attached and with no expectations. Beverly starting her period causes her to develop a sense of shame and fear because it's something that could provoke her father's anger or fixation. His desire to maintain control over her by infantilizing her or focusing on keeping her pure could symbolize this growing risk of escalation for Beverly. It's a reminder that she's maturing in a way that might further enrage or embolden her father. Her fear reflects the way abuse distorts natural milestones, turning them into triggers for deeper harm. Again, in The Body Keeps the Score, Vanderkolk talks about how trauma often results in fragmented, intrusive memories that individuals can't easily process. For Beverly, her abusive relationship with her father is reflected in her nightmares and her experience with Pennywise, who of course exploits this fear. But they manifest physically as her body recalls traumatic acts that make it hard for her to escape the feelings that they bring up. One of the ways we see Beverly handle these feelings is in the scene where she cuts off her hair after an encounter with her father. This act of defiance can also be seen as a form of self-protection for Beverly. She's trying to make herself less attractive in his eyes and attempt to regain some control over how she's perceived and treated. But when you think about it, this is also a very tragic moment because it shows that Beverly blames herself for her father's abusive behavior rather than him, who is gross. Since Pennywise is a creature that feeds on fear, it targets Beverly's most personal and intimate insecurities. The attack with her severed hair and the menstrual imagery is a calculated assault that combines her fear of womanhood with the shame and powerlessness she feels regarding her father's abuse. Her childhood provided her with limited safety, and the blood that she sees in the sink amplifies her fears. The overwhelming amount of blood represents her inability to stop this transition or protect herself from what it signifies. By weaponizing the cut hair and blood against Beverly, Pennywise is sending her a message that her attempts to escape are futile. This reinforces her fear that no matter what she does, she will remain under her father's influence. In the film, Bev has this final confrontation with her father that requires that she fight back and defend herself, which leaves him either unconscious or dead. The film doesn't specify. This is a turning point for Beverly. She refuses to be controlled or victimized any longer, but the confrontation likely also left her feeling emotionally raw and vulnerable. And who better to take the opportunity to capitalize on this than Pennywise? Pennywise shows up in the bathroom and overpowers Beverly, dragging her into the sewers, making her the only member of the Losers Club to be abducted by the enemy. Beverly at this point is no longer afraid of Pennywise, so he leaves her in a state of catatonia because he can't feed on her if there is no fear. Beverly, being the one left in a catatonic state, is deeply tied to her abuse by her father. Her fear of male dominance and control conditioned her to feel helpless and trapped in a way that the other losers may not understand. Her catatonic state symbolizes the way trauma can silence and immobilize survivors, trapping them in a helpless, frozen state where they can't fight back. It's also important that she be the one left catatonic because her character arc revolves largely around reclaiming her agency and self-worth. Throughout it, she moves from being a victim of her father's abuse to an empowered woman who ultimately fights back against her fears, both literal and symbolic. Beverly being the only girl in the Losers Club is also important. It helps her redefine relationships with males in a way that isn't predicated on fear or sexualization. She's been conditioned by her environment to understand relationships largely through the lens of male attention. Her ability to relate to the boys stems from this dynamic, as it's a context that she understands. In contrast to her relationship with adult men in Derry, the boys treat her with a mix of admiration, camaraderie, and awkward adolescent affection. This feels less threatening than the overt predatory behavior she experiences elsewhere. Beverly's status as the only girl might seem isolating, but the losers' shared vulnerability and fears create a space where she feels safe to exist outside the expectations that have been placed on her. Eddie is one of my favorite characters, but he's another character whose arc revolves around bodily autonomy and loss of agency, but in a way that's very different from Beverly. Eddie in the beginning may seem like a mama's boy. He's fragile and wrapped up in his mother's protective embrace, but there's something deeper and more sinister that's happening here with Eddie. And that's that his body has never been his own. Through his mother's manipulation of his fears and fabrication of his illnesses, she's caged him in, wielding control over every aspect of his life. Eddie finding out that the pills he was given were placebo pills is a defining moment for Eddie, or gazebo pills, as he calls them. This is a moment where he realized that he has been controlled. But also the pharmacist that agrees to it is also the pharmacist that flirts with Bev earlier in the film, and just like, what is wrong with the adults in this town? Every time Eddie took a pill, he reinforced the narrative that his mother has created, that he's weak, incapable of independence, and that he needs to be completely reliant on her for survival. Compared to the other losers, Eddie's trauma is quite unique. While their struggles stem from neglect or overt abuse, Eddie's come from a twisted sense of care. This distinction likely isolates Eddie from the others, making him feel simultaneously superior to them because he has a mother who cares, but would also likely make him feel deeply alone. Time for another history break. Eddie's story is quite unique because of the time period that the film takes place in. During the 80s, there was a phenomenon of latchkey kids. This was the generation of kids who were left to fend for themselves as their parents aspired to greater career pursuits. That was a brand new thing in the 80s. The 80s also saw an increase in media coverage of child abductions, such as the highly publicized case of Adam Walsh. This led to a stranger danger moral panic that fueled distrust of and paranoia around children's safety in public. At the same time, time, adults were being perceived as potential threats, creating an us versus them mentality that made children seem both vulnerable and somehow in need of restraint to protect them. This wasn't all that was going on in the 80s by far. There was the AIDS epidemic, the satanic panic, the drug war, etc. But it would make sense that Eddie's mother would think she was doing the right thing by keeping Eddie so close. But what she was doing wasn't protection, it was complete control. It's clear that Eddie's mother is deeply afraid of losing him either physically or emotionally. Her fear drives her to be excessively controlling, not only limiting Eddie's independence, but also trying to isolate him from friendships as she perceives them as a threat to their bond. This fear of abandonment she has likely stems from her own insecurities and possibly from past experiences that led her to feel that Eddie is the only person she can rely on for companionship and purpose. Like many overprotective parents, Eddie's mom may carry unresolved trauma, whether from her own childhood experiences, fear of loss, or even societal influences that push her to perceive the world as dangerous. This could lead her to see the world as a place filled with threats and illness, projecting these fears onto Eddie in an attempt to shield him from harm. Though it's not stated, her behavior reflects traits of Munchausen by proxy, a disorder in which a caregiver exaggerates or induces illness in a dependent to gain attention or sympathy. By keeping Eddie convinced he's sick or weak, she also receives validation of being a caring mother, which enhances her own sense of self-worth. Eddie's mom's overparenting highlights the pattern of Derry's adults and their negligent or flawed parenting. She's a great example of the way parents can wound their children, whether through fear or neglect, or in her case, a suffocating love that stifles Eddie's independence and self-confidence. Eddie's a reminder of how fear can be used as a form of control. While his fears seem practical, focusing and worrying about safety for the group, it's ultimately rooted in his mother's gaslighting. She's constructed this world where Eddie constantly feels like he's at risk, which isolates him further, which in turn makes him more susceptible to her influence into Catch-22. This is a stark contrast from the rest of the Losers Club, whose parents' absence or neglect leads them to develop a type of resilience Eddie hasn't had to learn. Like I mentioned earlier, Eddie is likely to have developed this idea that he's not like other kids, and this would create a subtle distance between him and the rest of the Losers Club. He seems to view himself as the more responsible or better off of the group. This belief would lead him to think he's doing the right thing by following his mom's rules, taking his pills, avoiding danger, and staying out of trouble overall. It's almost like he's internalized her voice to such a degree that it becomes part of his identity. Raise your hand if he's not the only one. So in a way, the barrier between Eddie and the group would likely be because he subconsciously sees their freedom and recklessness as a type of irresponsibility. What's more tragic, though, is that everything Eddie believes to be true is actually a false narrative. His health concerns aren't real, and his better situation is just a facade. This contradiction in reality and his beliefs likely causes some tension for Eddie. He wants to belong and be like the other kids, but he also feels compelled to uphold the identity his mother has crafted for him. This could explain moments where Eddie seems conflicted about truly connecting with the group, as his mom's influence subtly undermines their camaraderie. The realization that he's been lied to would also likely shatter his perception of both his mother but also of himself. The anger could easily turn inward, and Eddie might blame himself for not seeing through the facade sooner, or turn outward as he realizes the extent to which his childhood has been stolen from him. Now, the feeling of resentment wouldn't only be something that Eddie has to contend with. Stan will likely be dealing with some of these same feelings after being held to unrealistic standards by his father for what seems like the entirety of his childhood. Stan is definitely the most logical and skeptical member of the Losers Club. He is also my second favorite character. He initially tries to resist the idea that something supernatural is happening in Derry, as he values order, rationality, and control. This makes him more hesitant to believe the others about Pennywise and the terrors that they face. His personality contrasts with the more emotional or imaginative members of the group like Ben or Richie. Stanley's rationality isn't just a personality trait, but it's also a defense mechanism. His disbelief in the supernatural is his way of coping with the fear and trauma of the evil that is in Derry. He has trouble confronting the horrors of his past, much like how some people struggle to confront trauma in real life. His fear is deeply connected to his inability to let go of control. He's also deeply shaped by his father's expectations. His father's depicted as being stern, and there's a sense that Stan's trying to live up to his family's high expectations. This internal pressure to be perfect may contribute to his emotional restraint. His fears are also rooted in his personal history of Derry, including a traumatic encounter with Pennywise in the form of this terrifying mutated creature that showed up in the synagogue. This encounter encounter is pivotal as it's one of the first direct confrontations Stan has with the supernatural forces in town. One of the key themes in Stan's arc is the idea of fear and denial. Unlike the other members of the Losers Club who embrace their fears and try to understand them, Stan straight up rejects his fear. His attempt to deny the reality of Pennywise is a coping mechanism for dealing with his trauma and anxiety. His journey represents the psychological process of repressing fear and the consequences of not confronting it head on. His rationality comes at a cost. His refusal to believe in the supernatural keeps him disconnected from the group for much of the movie and isolates him emotionally. His struggle with accepting that the threat is real is a metaphor for how people try to rationalize or dismiss uncomfortable truth, especially when it comes to things like trauma and fear of the unknown. Stan is not initially as open as the others, but his membership in the Losers Club shows that even the most rational and seemingly detached individuals need a support system. Stan's confrontation with Pennywise in the synagogue is one of the most important moments, like I mentioned. It taps into his personal trauma, which is also directly tied to his Jewish identity. While the film's timeline moves the story to the 80s, Stan's struggle with faith, identity, and the unknown still echoes themes of generational trauma, especially for a Jewish child growing up in the shadows of World War II. For Stan, the creature in the synagogue is not just a fear of the unknown, but a manifestation of a deeper, more existential anxiety, the fragility of safety, the weight of expectation, and the inherited trauma of his ancestors. Though he might not fully understand the Holocaust, its shadow definitely looms over him and his family. The synagogue is a place of worship and sanctuary, becomes another corrupted safe space, just like the library will become for Ben. Stan's fear of the unknown, his need for order and rationality, can be seen as a response to the chaos and horror that his family likely experienced. He's a child caught between two worlds, the structured rituals of his faith and the messy, incomprehensible terror of Pennywise. The duality can mirror the struggles of Jewish communities in post-war America, grappling with the trauma of the displacement and genocide while trying to assimilate and find safety in a world that once sought to destroy them. Stanley also represents the tendency to repress emotions and deny fear in order to maintain control over your life. Stanley's relationship with his father and the pressure to conform to societal and familial expectations connects to the larger theme of perfectionism and the burden that it places on individuals. Stan's inability to freely express his fears reflect how expectations can stifle emotional growth and healing. In many religious communities, especially more traditional ones, there's an emphasis on faith and obedience rather than questioning or challenging established beliefs. This can create a culture where doubt is seen as something sinful or wrong. For Stan, a rational and intellectual character, this can mean that he learned to suppress his doubts not just about religion, but also about other aspects of his life, including his own fears. His inability to express his fear about Pennywise or even acknowledge the supernatural may stem from this religious conditioning as well. In some religious teachings, particularly within certain interpretations of Judaism, there's often an expectation to maintain control and not display vulnerability, especially in public or in sacred spaces. This could explain why Stan struggles to express his fears or acknowledge the terrors around him. He may have internalized the idea that expressing fear or vulnerability is a weakness or an affront to his faith. This encourages emotional fortitude and restraint. In many religious environments, authority figures hold significant sway. The idea that asking too many questions is somehow disrespectful or undermines faith is a common teaching. Stan's Jewish identity also likely faces him in a unique position within the predominantly Christian town of Derry. The external pressures of fitting in while also dealing with his own internal religious identity may have led him to suppress certain aspects of himself, particularly fear anything that felt unacceptable or uncontrollable. Ben is an overweight, shy, and socially awkward boy who Henry Bowers and his gang relentlessly bully. He's an outsider in Derry, having just moved to the city, and isolation seems to drive much of Ben's character. He is shown to be exceptionally intelligent, as in the film he's the one who uncovers Derry's dark past, and his knowledge of the town and its cycle of horror is what helps the losers understand what they're actually dealing with. Ben has a strong crush on Beverly, which adds a layer of emotional complexity to him. His romantic feelings and the way they're explored reflect themes of body image, self-worth, and unrequited love, especially in the context of the 80s cultural expectations of masculinity and beauty. Ben's affections for Beverly are pure, contrasting with the predatory behavior of the other boys who are either dismissive or harassing towards her. Ben's story is tightly tied to themes of body image, particularly in the way that he's bullied for being overweight. His struggle with self-esteem is amplified by feelings of inadequacy when it comes to other boys, especially his perceived competition with Bill, who has also also a romantic interest in Beverly. Let's talk about Ben's scene in the library for a little bit. As a new kid in town, isolated from his peers, Ben turns to the library to make sense of his surroundings. But his discovery of the 1908 ironworks explosion is no coincidence. Pennywise uses this tragedy as a way to terrorize Ben, reminding him and the audience that Derry's past is soaked in blood and horrors buried just beneath the surface. The ironworks explosion killed dozens of children, a parallel to the current disappearances that haunt the Losers Club. For Ben, who already feels out of place and unloved, this story becomes personal. The ghostly echo of these children robbed of their lives mirror Ben's own sense of invisibility. Pennywise exploits this connection, turning the historical tragedy into a personal horror, blurring the line between the past and present. There's a little bit more here that I want to dive into, and that is Ben's injuries. We talked about how Ben's story is wrapped up in conversations around self-esteem, and I think that theme is further explored in the times that Ben has been injured. Throughout chapter 1, whenever Ben is injured, it always seems to happen around his midsection. These are more than just physical wounds, but also a symbol of his vulnerability, both as a target of relentless bullying and as a boy searching for connection in a hostile environment. Henry Bauer's brutal carving of the letter H into Ben's stomach is an act of dehumanization, a way to brand Ben as less than, as someone to be marked and discarded. The midsection is a deeply symbolic part of the body. It houses the stomach, the center of nourishment and survival. By targeting this area, Henry's attack represents a direct assault on Ben's self-worth and his ability to sustain himself emotionally in a world that constantly tears him down. It's an external representation of the internal pain that Ben feels as the overweight new kid, always on the outside looking in. When Ben sustains another injury to his midsection during the climactic fight with Pennywise, it's not just a callback to the earlier attack, it's a turning point. This time, Ben's injury is sustained in the act of fighting back, of standing up for himself and for his friends. Unlike the earlier wound, which was inflicted as a form of cruelty, this cut is a mark of bravery and resilience. The shift from victimhood to empowerment is significant in many ways. These injuries reflect his emotional journey throughout the movie. He begins the story as a boy defined by his isolation and the pain inflicted by others, but he ends it as a valued member of the Losers Club, willing to bear physical pain to protect those he cares about. There's also an interesting duality to the significance of Ben's midsection injuries. On one hand, they're a reminder of the pain that he's endured, both physical and emotional. On the other hand, they point to the heart and compassion that define Ben's character. Richie, from the very beginning, is the group's clown. He's loud, brash, and loves to crack jokes, often using them to diffuse tension or to draw attention away from himself. For a lot of comedic characters, especially in horror or thriller films, humor hides a lot of the pain and insecurity, and Richie is no different. In order to really get into Richie's struggles, we would need to reference chapter 2, so since that's not the focus of the video, I'm going to cover them briefly, but just know that both Eddie and Stan will also have a larger part in the next video, along with Richie. Anyway, the group gave Richie the nickname Trash Mouth since he has a knack for saying literally whatever is on his mind. As we know to be true in real life as well, this behavior is a coping mechanism that helps him to hide his vulnerability and the fact that he's struggling with issues with his own identity beyond what most teenagers are struggling with. He's 100% a product of the 80s, making constant references to movies and pop culture, and this reinforces the idea that Richie's parents are probably not very present, meaning that Richie embodies that quintessential latchkey kid of the 80s we talked about earlier. The pop culture lens that Richie tends to see the world in is also a way to distance himself from where he lives in Derry. It helps him manage his fear and anxiety by treating everything like it's a joke or just part of a game. Richie's main struggle is his fear of being judged or misunderstood, especially regarding his identity, but again, that's not going to really become relevant until chapter 2. At the park with the rest of the Losers Club, Richie reveals that his ultimate fear is clowns. This is ironic because clowns typically function the same way that Richie does. They wear a mask and use humor to conceal what's underneath. I know that's a reach, but walk with me. The fear is both literal and metaphorical. On the surface, it's easy to think of his fear of clowns as stemming from the terror of Pennywise, but on a deeper level, clowns are a mirror for Richie's facade. Their painted smiles and exaggerated personalities reflect his fear of being exposed. Richie's fear is one I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. What happens when my mask slips? If my friends see the parts of me that I don't want to acknowledge, or the parts of myself that I may not even really fully understand just yet? Chapter 1 doesn't directly address Richie's sexuality, but the groundwork is there, mostly in the way he interacts with his friends and avoids deeper conversations about himself. Unlike the other losers, Richie doesn't have a clearly defined fear rooted in a traumatic event. His fear is more abstract, less about something specific, and more about the idea of exposure and loss of control. How However, the deeper he gets into the fight against Pennywise, the more it becomes clear that humor alone can't mask his real feelings. Richie's the character at first who is the least willing to acknowledge his fears. While the others are able to confront the trauma head on, he's more inclined to just deflect with humor. His relationships with the rest of the losers is pivotal to his growth. Despite his over-the-top personality, he's actually incredibly loyal and protective of the group. His friendship with Eddie in particular shows that Richie values people who can see past his humor and recognize the depths of who he is. Again, chapter 2. The Losers Club in general represents a space where Richie can let his guard down, even if it's hard for him to do at first. The group serves as a kind of refuge where he doesn't have to be a jokester all the time. He can also be himself, which is a major turning point in his character arc for now. I saved Bill for last, particularly because the story kicks off with his tragedy, and I wanted to be able to put the other Losers Club in perspective first, because we have a bit to talk about when it comes to Bill's relationship with the rest of them, but also their relationship to the tragedy that Bill is going through. Bill's parents, particularly his mother, are portrayed as deeply disconnected and emotionally absent, especially after Georgie's death. I would argue that it was shown even before his death, because did you see how little Georgie was and he just ran out the front door and his mom didn't say anything? He was a baby. What are you doing? Why are you not paying attention? Their detachment, although it likely existed in a sense previously, is a manifestation of their overwhelming grief and denial, which causes them to withdraw from their surviving child Bill and the world around them. Rather than processing their grief, they retreat into numbness, cutting themselves off emotionally and leaving Bill to deal with the aftermath alone. Just a sidebar, I'm laughing because in the script I said Bill to Dill, but I spelled it Dill. Jesus. This is what happens when you write scripts late at night. This detachment allows them to continue functioning on the surface, but leaves them unable to connect with Bill, who represents a painful reminder of George. Bill's parents ignore a deeper horror around them. Derry is steeped in a culture of silence and denial, heavily influenced by Pennywise's presence. Bill's parents are no exception. Their refusal to engage with Georgie's death or Bill's suffering is part of the larger supernatural apathy of the town. By turning away from their son's needs and from the emotional aftermath of Georgie's death, they reflect Derry's collective refusal to confront the darkness that lurks beneath the town's surface. Bill's parents may subconsciously blame Bill for Georgie's death since Bill was sick on the day Georgie went out to play. We'll talk about that in chapter 2. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but I just want to reiterate that there are some things I am not touching on or talking about because this is a huge story and there is 2 parts of the video. It's irrational and unspoken for them to blame Bill, but it's not uncommon for grieving families to harbor resentment in tragic situations, especially if someone close to the event could possibly be seen as responsible, however unfair that may be. This is likely driving them to create emotional distance between themselves and Bill, who already carries survivor's guilt and feels this lack of connection. Bill can't rely on the adults in his life for support, and this forces him to look for comfort and protection from his friends. Bill is a boy that is caught in the grips of grief. For Bill, Georgie's death is more than just the loss of his sibling, but a rupture in his reality. His guilt over sending Georgie out into the storm fuels this relentless need to confront Pennywise, to find closure in the only way he knows how. But grief is a cage, and Bill's inability to let go keeps him trapped in a cycle of pain and obsession. This obsession then leads Bill to push his friends to their limits, sometimes without fully considering their safety. To him, the danger doesn't matter. What matters is making Georgie's death mean something. In It Chapter 1, Bill's single-minded focus on Pennywise is both his strength and his flaw. His leadership unites the losers and drives them to confront their fears, but it also risks alienating them. In the house on Neibolt Street, Bill's determination nearly cost Eddie his life. This moment underscores the fine line between bravery and recklessness, especially when grief clouds your judgment. Bill's grief blinds him to the consequences of his actions. To him, the fight against Pennywise isn't just about defeating a monster. It's about redeeming himself for what he perceives as his failure to protect Georgie. But this mindset inadvertently mirrors Pennywise's strategy, preying on guilt, fear, and vulnerability. Pennywise exploits this by using Georgie's image to weaken Bill's resolve. It's a chilling reminder that grief can make people vulnerable to manipulation, especially when they refuse to confront the finality of their loss. Bill's entrapment in his grief mirrors the broader cycle of trauma that grips the town of Derry. Just as Bill is unable to move on from Georgie's death, the town itself is stuck in a repeating pattern of violence and denial. Both Bill and Derry cling to familiar pain rather than face the uncertainty of moving forward. What sets Bill apart is his willingness to act even if his actions are flawed. His determination, while reckless, becomes a catalyst for the losers to confront their own fears and break the cycle. So in this way, Bill's grief is not just a burden, but it can also be considered a source of strength. Okay, so I think we need to have a conversation about the town of Derry as a whole, but I think I'm going to do a video on Derry by itself because there's a lot, and it includes the Stephen King cinematic universe. And then also with the new show, Welcome to Derry, coming out very soon, I feel like we're going to get a lot of new lore that can shed light on things that have no answers. So considering that the show is also supposed to be taking place before It Chapter 1. So I think the Welcome to Derry takes place in the 50s. So I'm going to hold off for a second. Let's talk about the others in the film for a second, including the brief moments we get with other adults and the one I've been wanting to talk about, Henry. What is wrong with that kid? In It Chapter 1, the most chilling thing to me is how the town's adults just never intervene when anything is happening. The librarian ignores Ben's intense bullying, Beverly's father abuses her without any retaliation, and the pharmacist goes along with giving Eddie fake pills at his mother's request. And even Henry is being abused by his own father. Like, the town's adults are the embodiment of moral decay. Their complicity is part of why Pennywise has such a grip on the town. His presence amplifies fears and apathy, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of harm. This makes Derry a metaphor for systemic failures in real-world communities where silence often perpetuates harm. So the question is, do the adults know about Pennywise? I think we're going to get some answers to that in Welcome to Derry, but I do want to give some insight into what I think and understand based on some interviews that Stephen King has done over the years. So the adults are said to have a subconscious awareness of Pennywise, but they're either unable to or unwilling to acknowledge it. King suggests that its pervasive influence over the entire town affects not just the children who encounter Pennywise, but also the adults who seem to live in a state of denial or numbness. This influence creates a sense of apathy or selective blindness, which allows Pennywise to prey on children without fear of interference. In the 80s, societal awareness and resources for children experiencing bullying, neglect, or abuse were still developing. While progress was being made, many issues related to children's welfare were either overlooked or inadequately addressed due to limited understanding, stigma, and societal norms. Bullying was often dismissed as kids being kids and rites of passage. It was rarely seen as a serious issue, and many adults, including teachers and parents, encouraged children to just toughen up or ignore it. This lack of intervention left many children without the tools or support to deal with bullying effectively. Anti-bullying campaigns were non-existent in the 80s, and schools were less likely to have structured programs or guidelines for addressing bullying. Teachers and administrators were untrained in how to recognize or handle it, and that left it largely unaddressed. The 80s also saw a gradual increase in mandatory reporting laws in the US, requiring teachers, doctors, and other professionals to report suspected child abuse. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and many cases were unreported due to fear, stigma, or lack of training on how to even identify abuse in the first place. CPS existed in the 80s, but it was still pretty much evolving. Agencies often lacked funding, staffing, and resources needed to handle the volume of cases effectively. Many children remained in harmful situations due to systemic failures or legal battles. Campaigns like It's 10 p.m., Do You Know Where Your Child Is? And organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children began raising awareness about child safety and abuse. However, these initiatives primarily focused on stranger danger and missing children, not domestic abuse or neglect. The town of Derry in It Chapter 1 reflects the era's limitations in child advocacy. These cultural shortcomings deepen the horror of the story because the children have to rely on themselves to confront Pennywise and the abuseful, neglectful adults in their lives. This lack of a safety net intensifies the stakes and underscores how resilient the Losers Club really is. Henry Bowers. Henry is a deeply troubled individual with a lot of pain, anger, and resentment, making him the ideal pawn for Pennywise. Henry's violent tendencies towards the Losers Club provide Pennywise with a natural ally who can act on his behalf with his own vendetta against the losers. By using Henry, Pennywise can deepen his descent into madness and amplify Henry's violent urges, effectively weaponizing Henry's existing hatred and cruelty. It generally operates in the shadows, maintaining a degree of secrecy to avoid detection. But by using Henry, it can keep a lower profile by letting someone else, Henry, do the dirty work. Having a human antagonist who is also relentless and violent increases the amount of fear the losers experience, making them more vulnerable. So to the Losers Club, they're facing a double threat: the supernatural terror and Henry's physical violence. This would explain why it didn't kill Henry, but rather influenced Henry to kill his father and then go after the Losers Club. Henry was much more useful to him alive than he would have been dead. It's pretty clear that Henry is being abused by his father, and as a result, Henry is filled with rage and hate that allows it to exploit this weakness and corrupt someone who's already troubled. Henry likely believes he's acting on his own accord, but he's being manipulated. While Pennywise is immensely powerful, he doesn't always directly attack, which has to do with the nature of his power and the rules that he has to follow. It can't always act in the physical realm without drawing attention to itself. Henry, as a human, has the freedom to move around, get close to the losers, and act in ways it can't without drawing attention to itself. It's important to remember that Pennywise, I'm going to go back to calling it Pennywise because it is confusing me. It's important to remember that Pennywise doesn't create Henry's violent tendencies, he just amplifies them. Pennywise likely recognizes that the losers' greatest power against him is their bond, and by sending Henry after them, Pennywise is trying to weaken that bond. Henry's attack creates internal conflict, distracts the losers, and increases their sense of danger, which Pennywise hopes will cause fractures in the Losers Club unity. The more fear and discord Pennywise can foster within the group, the more likely their resistance will weaken. I also want to note here that Henry is a shit, but he's also a casualty of Derry and its adults. We'll talk more about him again in part 2, but there are clues in part 1 that he may be struggling with his own identity or his own sexuality, and this is in reference to his father calling him a paper boy and demeaning him in front of his friends. After the encounter with his father, he and his friends sit on the side of the car with Henry clearly upset, and his friends, instead of ragging on Henry, actually ask if he's okay, which I think says a lot personally. These are kids who have been ignored and abandoned by the adults around them, who you think would either care or step in on their behalf when they realize that they're being mistreated. Of course, Henry doesn't open up to his friends and keeps it inside, and he's meant to be an obvious foil to the Losers Club. He's unable to fight Pennywise's advances, not only because he's so angry, but because he's in isolation and has nobody to lean on for support. Henry and the gang's actions are odd and not indicative of the way most teenagers behave. So for none of the teachers at this school to step in and realize that he needs intervention proves that there is a cycle in the town that needs to be addressed. All right, enough about people. Let's talk about some symbolism, some symbols. Few symbols in the movie It are as iconic as Georgie's yellow raincoat and the ominous red balloon. First made famous in the 1990 miniseries, the red balloon has become a hallmark of the franchise, a visual cue that danger is near. Whether it's luring Ben into the basement, floating in Beverly's bathroom, or tied to Georgie himself, the balloon is a constant presence throughout the film. The red balloon is closely tied to Pennywise, signaling his approach and the impending danger he brings. Its bright, festive color is a contrast with the horror that often follows, turning it into a symbol of fear and dread. The balloon's carnival-like allure is a tool of manipulation, distracting and enticing children with its appearance while exploiting their curiosity and innocence to lead them to harm. Traditionally, balloons are associated with joy, parties, and childhood innocence. The red balloon subverts this expectation, becoming a threat of loss and corruption. It represents how Pennywise twists and destroys the innocence of Derry's children, embodying the loss of safety and freedom that the losers experience over the course of the film. The floating balloon also serves as a reminder of Pennywise's omnipresence. It appears in places where his influence is strongest, signaling that his reach extends far beyond the moments when he's physically present. This constant visual creates a sense of inescapable dread, reinforcing the idea that Pennywise is everywhere, lurking just beneath the surface of Derry's facade. The phrase "we all float" in It encapsulates a chilling metaphor for emotional and psychological disconnection. This represents how trauma suspends its victims in a liminal state between survival and destruction. For the losers in the town of Derry as a whole, floating signifies an inability to confront their fears, histories, and futures. It's a dissociative state that shields them from the constant threat of violence, neglect, and fear, but also leaves them detached from reality. This floating is not just a gentle drift, but a suspension above a dark abyss. Trauma drags its victims beneath the surface, leaving them trapped in a cycle of fear and pain. Pennywise amplifies this by preying on deeply personal anxieties, forcing his victims to confront their fears while holding them in a limbo where they're alive but not truly living. The hidden nature of Derry's collective trauma is another layer of this metaphor. Beneath the town's seemingly idyllic facade lies a history of violence, secrets, and darkness. Both the losers and the town's residents float above their fears, avoiding the depth of their pain until Pennywise forces it to the surface, threatening to consume them entirely. Pennywise's lair represents a literal and haunting manifestation of this concept. The suspended bodies of his victims symbolize how trauma leaves people stuck in time, unable to heal or move forward. These children's suspensions reflect decay, death, and the inescapable reality of mortality, which the losers are forced to confront far earlier than most. Ultimately, floating represents the loss of innocence. For the losers, their dreams and freedoms, once untethered and full of potential, are now unreachable, stolen by the horrors of abuse, neglect, and supernatural terror. The floating balloons mock the innocence of childhood celebrations. Transforming symbols of joy into harbingers of death. Yet, floating also serves as a survival mechanism. To endure life in Derry, the losers and other children emotionally distance themselves from the horrors around them. This detachment helps them survive, but also deepens their disconnection, reinforcing the metaphor of drifting through life without truly being present. And that's a wrap on part 1 of our deep dive into It Chapter 1. We talked about the meaning behind We All Float, the creepy ass red balloon. We talked about how trauma manifests in these poor kids. And in part 2, we'll talk about what this looks like when they become adults and when they finally face themselves and Pennywise again. So in the meantime, if you've enjoyed this analysis, you might like my breakdowns of Carrie and Rocky Horror. I will link them here so you can click on either one and they'll be in the description. As always, thank you for watching, commenting, and sharing your thoughts. Let me know in the comments if you want me to cover the It miniseries or dive into Derry's history as a whole and do like the Stephen King cinematic universe. So down to do that. And I will see you guys in the next one. Happy New Year.